Hello everybody. Now I'd like to turn our attention to Chapter 7. We're going to talk about the emotional development of infants and toddlers. Before we get too far into the contents of this lecture, I just wanted to let you all know I'm so pleased with the performance I've seen on the exam and the quality of work that we're getting, particularly in the applied assignments. So keep it up. I appreciate the diligence. As many of you are probably seeing, once you can get into a discipline of engaging with this material and just keep working on doing those weekly lessons, I think you'll find that this material will sink in because you're interacting with it in different ways. As you've noticed, we've moved the deadlines of all assignments to the end of each section, but if you would like to stay on track with the weekly assignment routine that we had at first established, take a look at the module titles. Each of those include a date range that if I were teaching this live, those would be the dates I would be aiming to deliver that material. All right, so thanks for all of your hard work. It's very encouraging to me as your instructor to see such good learning going on. Let's talk about the emotional development of infants and toddlers. So first, it's important to get a general understanding of the timing of certain key aspects of emotional development. So typically, at about 6 weeks, we see infants smile at others to show that they are interested, to basically send affection. So social smiles that feel connected begin at about 6 weeks. Now, this is an improvement in the sense that prior to 6 weeks, from birth to about that point, the primary affect state you may see in an infant could be one of distress or sometimes contentment, which is a little bit more of a calm, a little bit flatter. So when the social smile emerges at 6 weeks, it kind of feels like an emotional door has opened in a developing baby's life. That sense of connectedness that you feel as an adult is really remarkable. By about 3 months, we see the development of laughter and increasing curiosity. At 4 months, these smiles are joyful, and at about 4 to 8 months, you start to see the child differentiate anger or being mad or frustrated, and that expression becomes clearer and less vague. From 9 to 14 months, you start to see a typical trajectory of being hesitant to engage in new situations, particularly new social situations. So there seems to be a typically developing stranger anxiety that can emerge at around 9 to 14 months, which is completely normal and something that the child will work through. At about a year of age, there are usually some fears of unexpected sights and sounds. It's completely normal to startle and seem to be distressed by changes in the environment. And by about 18 months, what you should see in the developmental trajectory is this development of what we would call secondary emotions. These are feelings that you can only have once you've developed enough self-awareness about your own feelings. So you can only feel pride if you understand that what somebody else thinks of you is a good thing. In order for you to understand that, you have to have a sense of yourself, that you are a coherent being that is separate from other people. So we would say that a certain amount of social cognition, social understanding, some of which is self-awareness, is necessary to experience the secondary emotions of pride, shame, and embarrassment, which emerge at about 18 months. So emotional development is something where we have a typical trajectory of the onset of emotional displays. Interestingly, most of these trajectories are consistent across cultures. There could be differences in hedonic tone or how much intensity one puts to emotional expressions, but in general, there's consistency in the series of stages that a developing child goes through. So early on, it's really important to provide high emotional responsiveness to infants and toddlers. And in a sense, you match what's going on with the baby as a way of connecting. And these early emotions then can develop through that social bond. It's also important, as you learn how to read an infant's emotional expressions, to be able to identify when the baby is upset. And once you get to know the baby well, to try to differentiate different kinds of upset or discomfort or pain as the baby is also becoming more aware of his or her own experiences. So as we mentioned, you start getting that social smile at about 6 weeks, and it usually happens when an infant's looking at your face, and then full-blown laughter at about 3 to 4 months. So as the developing baby is going through new emotional experiences, those emotional experiences actually contribute to the release of certain neural hormones, certain chemicals in your system, which are going to impact how the brain develops. So what we mean here is that there's a lot of research that helps us see that the emotional experiences of the developing child can impact brain development. Now, while negative affects like anger and sadness, they're really healthy, they're important for a baby to experience, it's difficult if those are the predominant emotions that a baby experiences. In other words, if they're the only thing that they experience, or takes on the majority, or is too intense. So these negative affect states, which are usually healthy, can be dangerous to the baby if they are extensive. And unpredictability is actually a state of discomfort for a developing baby. So you can see an undifferentiated anger, sadness, distress that might come from the baby just being confused in a sense about what's going on. So at about 6 months, we should see some healthy anger from a baby. In the first few months, you should see some sadness. But if you see way too much, or if the parent is undergoing ongoing and persistent depression or sadness, then we have to be really careful about what the infant's emotional context is. To be raised with a parent who is emotionally removed or consistently angry is just painful for the developing baby. It throws off his or her hormonal balance. So it's part of the reason that if a mom or a dad or another caregiver is going through depression, and the reason I say moms is that depression after giving birth is a significant challenge for many women. The chemicals involved in that whole process can move a woman's mood into a very difficult spot. And so it's important to pay attention to the caregiver's mood, caregiver's emotion around the developing infant. At certain ages, that infant is going to be particularly vulnerable to excessive emotions. And so sometimes the best ways that we can support the emotional development of young children is to support the emotional development of their caregivers. Now, it's typical for young children at about 9 months to start to show some hesitancy or fear about new experiences. Stranger wariness is a very developmentally appropriate thing. It's kind of like the infant can now recognize the difference between familiar and unfamiliar caregivers, and the unpredictability of not knowing who this person is developmentally, it's a developmentally appropriate stressor, so to speak. So that's completely reasonable. The more experiences a child has with strangers, the less likely they will respond in a heightened emotional way, but they still may show some very healthy wariness. At around 9 to 12 months is also when we see a developmentally typical emergence of separation anxiety, where the child may cry or look really confused or hurt when a parent leaves her or him to go to work or to attend a meeting. So being left by the caregiver with physical distance, usually in a healthy parent-child relationship, causes some healthy separation anxiety on behalf of the infant. The infant usually learns how to self-soothe and manage that anxiety, but if it does persist by around the age of 3.5, then you may want to seek out some assistance, because now the separation anxiety is moved away from a developmentally typical manifestation and has moved towards something that could benefit from some support. So during the toddler period, emotions become stronger and stronger, and the developing child's cognitive capacities improve so that they remember things longer. They'll connect experiences with different emotions. You will also see that as they become better skilled in the use of their bodies, they can get their own needs met, they can start to communicate better. You begin to see some behavioral challenges get better over time. Usually in the second year of life, anger and fear will become less frequent, but they can become more focused. And so you'll have fewer problem times with an older toddler, but when those problems occur, they're really significant. Over time, toddlers learn how to discriminate when other people are laughing or crying, and they also begin to laugh and cry in appropriate situations. You can see what people call the terrible twos, where the developing child may want something that he or she can't have, or doesn't yet have the skills to accomplish something that he or she would like to do. You often have a stronger desire for something than the skills to pull it off. Could be underlying a temper tantrum. And not yet being able to communicate your intentions or your wants with words very fluently can really lend itself to an increase in acting out behaviors. And usually as parents, a cool, calm, matter-of-fact approach can really help get past those temper tantrums. We'll talk more about supporting positive behaviors in a different lecture. At around this time in the second year of life, we see social awareness increasing. Now, this is going to vary by the culture that the child is growing up in, but these secondary emotions that you see on the screen do begin to develop at about 18 months and beyond. Part of what's necessary for this, as I mentioned before, is developing a sense of self-awareness, or realizing that you are a distinct person from the other people, and that what you are thinking is not always the same as what somebody else is thinking. Psychologists call this intersubjectivity. But this self-awareness becomes not only important for cognitive gains, but it really contributes to emotional development in young children. Without understanding the difference between self and other, you actually can't develop empathy or a sense of generosity. There has to be an understanding that this other person is different from me. He's feeling something different than me, but it's still real. It's not my emotion, it's his emotion. And that two different emotions can happen simultaneously in two different people. So that differentiation of self and other is critical for the development of a sense of understanding of someone else's pain and some concern about someone else's pain that we call empathy. Now, generosity, if you were to describe it as the desire to share just for the innate pleasure of sharing with someone, that sort of unselfish generosity will also emerge from self-awareness over time. But infants under 18 months really don't have a clearly differentiated self and other, and will become quite frustrated and confused if your feeling state is not matching theirs. Well, one of the ways that we've learned about the development of self-awareness in young children is through a series of studies that looked at mirror recognition. Basically, what they do is they take babies of different ages, anywhere from 9 months to about 2 years, and they'd put a little dot of red makeup or rouge on their forehead, and then they'd introduce a mirror, and they'd see if the baby recognized himself in the mirror, he would try to touch the red dot on his forehead. If he wasn't old enough or mature enough yet to identify that the person he was looking at was him, have some self-awareness, he wouldn't know to reach for the red dot on his head. So in all of these studies, none of the babies younger than a year showed behaviors that demonstrated awareness of a mirror. But infants who were about 15 months to 2 years would show the self-awareness because they touched the part of their body that is marked with makeup. So those mirror recognition tasks are a way of looking at this really important emotional skill that we call self-awareness. So just as developing children are beginning to understand the emotions of others, they are also learning how to express emotions and how to modulate or regulate those emotional expressions. This is a very complex topic. As a psychologist, I often am working with children who have difficulties regulating their feelings. They can actually get so happy that it's hard for them to behave well. They can get devastatingly sad and it's hard for them to behave well. And it's thought that this ability to regulate your emotional expression so that it fits kind of the demands of the environment has a lot to do with how well connected your brain has become. In particular, how mature the connections are across different parts of your frontal lobes. So we need to have connections between your decision making, impulse control, coordinating part of your brain, which we call the prefrontal cortex, with the fear center of your brain, which we call the amygdala. And the more experience that you have in the world managing emotions in your culture, that's going to shape the connections between your fear center and your decision-making center. So the ability to regulate emotions, that all begins in infancy and toddlerhood. It's very strongly affected by what's going on around us. The experiences that we have, the nurture aspect of things has a big role to play in learning how to appropriately manage anger, sadness, frustration, that sort of thing. And in fact, it's really critical that the social relationship between the developing child and caregivers is strong, because this is a really important place where we can impact emotional development of young children. And that's in the aspects of the social bond where emotions are learned. So in a few minutes here, when I finish up with this lecture, I'll do a separate lecture on social bonds, and we'll talk about that infrastructure for emotion. What I want you to know right now is we do have an interaction between the biology of the brain and the environment around the young child as we look at emotions learning how to be regulated. And one could really argue that understanding how the brain regulates emotions could be hugely important for our culture. It could have a lot to do with preventing violence, for example, or engendering some skills that would allow us to be more helpful to each other in times of tragedy or stress. So understanding how different aspects of our experience change the connectivity in our emotional brains has become a very important area of study in psychology. It's also important to keep in mind that while the developing child is having all these experiences that are, in a sense, sculpting his or her emotional brain, they're also in active social contexts more and more. The older that children get, usually the larger their social circle gets. So as infants move into toddlerhood, into preschool, we often see the social circle getting larger, and you start to have more and more opportunities to be around other children and to practice emotional regulation with peers as well as with adults. So in conclusion, there is a ton happening in the emotional development of infants and toddlers. There's a whole symphony of nature and nurture interacting. And I hope that you've taken the time to look into some of the narratives in your text that I think tell the story very, very well. It's also really important to keep in mind that the emotional development that we talk about in this developmental period is going to likely have a large role in the emotional well-being of children later in their lives. This is a time of building a foundation. So it's very, very important that we try to do what we can to provide a nurturing environment. And a big part of that is what I'll cover in the next lecture on social bonds. Thank you for your attention.